Before sunrise, 3 German sentries were found dead inside their own defensive line. No gunshots, no alarm, no footprints anyone could explain. Just silence, and one warning left behind on their helmets. The ground in front of them was completely open. German machine guns covered every meter. Flares lit the darkness again and again through the night. No trees, no hills, no deep trenches, no place for a man to hide. And yet somehow, Canadian soldiers had crossed that exposed ground, entered the German position, killed silently, and vanished before anyone knew they had been there. That was the part the Germans could not explain. And what happened along the Mussolini Canal in 1944 was not a legend. It was the beginning of a fear that would follow Canadian soldiers across Europe. Italy, Normandy, the Scheldt, the Rhineland. Again and again, German officers would write the same thing in different words. They move without being seen. They appear from nowhere. They disappear in open ground. But the truth was even stranger than the reports. The Canadians were not using magic. They were not using some secret weapon. They were using something the Germans could not see, because they had never been taught to see the land the way Canadians did. February the 2nd, 1944, south of Rome, the Mussolini Canal. A German non-commissioned officer from the Hermann Göring division walked slowly along the forward positions at first light. Several sentries had failed to report during the night, and at first, he probably expected a broken wire, a missed signal, maybe a man asleep at his post. Then he found the first body. The sentry was slumped against the wall of a drainage ditch, his weapon still near him, his body resting in the cold mud as if he had simply collapsed. There was no bullet wound, no explosion, no sign that he had even raised his rifle. His throat had been cut with terrifying precision. The kind of wound that tells you the killer was close enough to touch him, close enough to control the moment, close enough to leave no chance for a cry. But that was not what froze the German NCO in place. On the dead man's helmet, someone had pressed a small sticker, a red arrowhead symbol, and beneath it, a message in German. The worst is yet to come. He moved down the line and found the second sentry. Same wound, same silence, same sticker. Then the third. 3 German soldiers dead inside a defended position, without a shot being fired, without a flare exposing the attackers, without one surviving guard raising the alarm. Now imagine being the officer who had to write that report. The Allied line was not hidden in a forest. It was not behind a mountain ridge. It was across flat, drained marshland. The space between the lines was open enough that German machine gunners believed nothing could cross it alive. Flares went up throughout the night. Observation posts watched the approaches. Every obvious route was covered. And still, someone had come through. Not only crossed the ground, but entered the German line, killed 3 men, left a warning, and escaped back across the same open terrain. This was not the first incident. Over the previous days, German units along the Mussolini Canal had been reporting things that sounded impossible. Sentries disappearing from posts and being found later. Telephone wires cut in areas that were supposedly under observation. Men waking before dawn, and realizing someone had been close enough to steal equipment or kill quietly. And again, that red arrowhead appeared like a signature, a message, a promise. Weeks later, a German officer would write in his diary that the Black Devils were around them every night. They never saw them. They never heard them. They only knew they had been there after something had already happened. And that sentence tells you everything about the psychological effect these men had. They were not only killing German soldiers. They were making German soldiers doubt the safety of the ground beneath their own feet. The men behind these raids belonged to the 1st Special Service Force, the legendary Canadian-American commando unit later remembered as the Devil's Brigade. But many of the men who terrified German defenders were Canadian volunteers. And this is where the story becomes bigger than one canal in Italy. Because what made these men so dangerous was not invented by the army. It was not created in a classroom. It was not something that could be handed to a soldier in a manual. It came from where they were born, how they were raised, and what kind of land had shaped their eyes before they ever wore a uniform. If you enjoy forgotten stories from the Second World War, hit the like button now because this story only gets more unbelievable from here. And subscribe if you want history told with the details most people never hear. Because what the Germans faced in Italy was only the first glimpse of something they would never fully understand. The German lieutenant's confusion was understandable. He was a professional soldier. He had been trained by one of the most disciplined and tactically advanced armies in the world. He understood patrols. He understood camouflage. He understood the use of darkness, cover, fire, and concealment. German officers knew how men moved in war. They knew what to watch for. They knew how to defend a line. And that was exactly why this disturbed them so much. What they were seeing did not fit the rules they trusted. This was not a normal infiltration. It was not simply a night raid. It was not men crawling behind smoke or using deep trenches. It looked like soldiers were crossing ground that should expose them, then dissolving into the terrain as if the earth had swallowed them. And it did not stop in Italy. Months later, in Normandy, German defenders would watch Canadian infantry enter wheat fields and then lose sight of them before they reached the other side. They did not see them run away. They did not see them drop behind a wall. The men simply vanished inside a field that German observers believed they could see. Minutes later, Canadian fire would erupt from a flank, from a ditch, from a patch of wheat, from a position the Germans had marked as empty. Then, in the Scheldt estuary, one of the flattest and most exposed battlefields in Western Europe, German officers again believed no one could cross the ground without being spotted. And once again, Canadian soldiers crossed it. Not easily, not without cost. But they crossed it. And when they arrived, German defenders asked the same question they had asked in Italy. How did they get here? Where did they come from? How did they move across open ground without being seen? The Germans searched for a military answer. They wanted a technique, a trick, a doctrine, a special method they could study and counter. But they were asking the wrong question. The answer was not only tactical, it was geographical, it was cultural, it was generational. To understand why Canadian soldiers could disappear in ground that looked open, you have to understand the country that produced them. In 1939, when Canada entered the war, it was one of the largest countries on Earth, nearly 10 million square kilometers from the Atlantic to the Pacific and north into the Arctic. But most of that land was not crowded with towns, railways, villages, and roads. Much of it was empty in a way that many Europeans could barely imagine. Not empty like a quiet farm field, empty like hundreds of kilometers without a town, empty like forests where sound disappears, empty like prairie horizons that stretch until the sky bends, empty like frozen marshes, northern lakes, mountain passes, and tundra, where a mistake could kill you long before an enemy ever could. A man raised in Europe might think of wilderness as a forest with paths and villages nearby. A Canadian raised in the north, on the prairie, in the bush, on a reserve, or in a remote farming community, understood wilderness differently. Wilderness was not scenery. It was work. It was hunger. It was weather. It was distance. It was silence. It was learning how to move without wasting energy, how to read the ground, how to notice what changed, how to understand a landscape that did not announce its dangers out loud. Canada had just over 11 million people in 1939, spread across a landmass larger than most European soldiers could mentally measure. Outside the major cities, much of the country was made of farms, small towns, reserves, logging areas, fishing villages, ranches, mining camps, trap lines, and remote communities. And when Canada called for volunteers, many of the men who stepped forward brought with them skills that armies usually had to teach from nothing. They could already read land. They could already move quietly. They could already wait. They could already understand that open ground is not always open if you know where to look. A wheat farmer from Saskatchewan did not need a training instructor to explain the value of a small fold in the earth. He had spent his life watching land change with wind, light, rain, and season. He knew that a slight dip could break a silhouette. He knew that the line between being seen and not being seen might be only a few inches. A trapper from northern Ontario understood silence differently from a city recruit. One bad step could crack a branch and ruin a day's work. One careless movement could spook an animal long before it came into range. A Cree hunter from northern Manitoba could read bent grass, disturbed snow, broken brush, and soft mud like signs written directly into the earth. An Ojibwe scout could move through marsh and forest using changes in shadow, waterline, wind, and vegetation that most men would never notice. This was not fieldcraft to them. It was life. And that is the difference. A soldier can be trained to crawl. He can be trained to wear camouflage. He can be taught to stay low and keep quiet. but it is much harder to train a grown man to see land differently. That kind of vision is learned young. It becomes instinct. It becomes part of the body. It becomes the moment a man lowers his head before he knows why, the moment he freezes because the wind has stopped moving the grass, the moment he chooses a route nobody else sees because, to him, the ground is speaking. Indigenous Canadian soldiers brought some of the deepest examples of this skill. Many First Nations, Métis and Inuit volunteers came from communities where hunting, tracking, patience and observation were not weekend hobbies. They were survival skills passed down through families and generations. Officers often noticed that these men saw details other soldiers missed. They could detect movement at distance. They could sit motionless for hours. They could track signs that others walked over. One officer described some of them as snipers from birth. It sounds dramatic, but it points to a truth the Germans would never fully grasp. These men were not simply trained to observe. They had been raised inside observation. When Canadian volunteers arrived for training in Britain, British instructors sometimes found them rough around the edges. Many were not polished parade ground soldiers. Some were independent, blunt, unimpressed by rank, and not naturally suited to the rigid style of military ceremony. But when exercises moved into fields, woods, hills, and open terrain, something changed. The same men who might look undisciplined on parade could become astonishingly controlled on the ground. They did not always move like textbook soldiers. They moved like hunters, slow when slowness mattered, still when stillness mattered, fast only when the next cover had already been chosen. They seemed to know where to go before others knew there was a place to go. A British recruit might look at a field and see empty space between two hedges. A Canadian farm boy might see 3 hidden dips, 1 drainage rut, a darker strip of grass, and a low line that would conceal movement if he crawled instead of ran. That difference could not always be explained in words. The British noticed it. They wrote it down in training reports. But one Canadian training centre took it further and turned that instinct into a weapon. That place was Vernon, British Columbia. In 1942, the Canadian Army built a battle drill training system in terrain that punished careless men. Vernon sat in a valley surrounded by mountains, with dry grassland, pine forests, gullies, creek beds, slopes, heat, dust, and ground that looked simple from a distance, but became complicated the moment you had to move across it under pressure. The point was not to make soldiers look impressive in formation. The point was to teach them how to survive when the air above them was full of bullets. The training was brutal. Live ammunition made lessons unforgettable. Men learned fast that raising your head at the wrong time was not a small mistake. It was the end of your life. But the most important lessons were not just about staying low. They were about reading dead ground. Dead ground is the land the enemy cannot see from his position. It might be a dip, a fold, a shallow depression, the backside of a slight rise, a ditch, or a line where the earth falls away just enough to hide a moving body. To a man standing up, it may look like nothing. To a man crawling under machine gun fire, it can be a road. A depression only a few inches deep might not appear important on a map. But maps do not bleed. A man does. And if that depression hides his helmet from a German observer for 30 seconds, it matters. If it lets him crawl another 20 yards, it matters. If it gets him close enough to throw a grenade, it matters. This was the lesson Canadian soldiers learned and relearned. Open ground is only open to the man who cannot read it. They were also taught the stock. Slow movement, patient movement, movement so controlled that the enemy's eyes stop recognizing it as movement. Human beings are drawn to speed and sudden change, so a good stalker gives the eye nothing to catch. He moves when the grass moves. He stops when the wind stops. He freezes when a flare rises. He lets time do the work. This was not glamorous. It was cold, dirty, exhausting, and frightening. But it worked. A man who runs across a field becomes a target. A man who moves inch by inch through the correct line of ground can become almost invisible. But Vernon did not invent this. It formalized something older. The Canadian Army had already built a reputation in the First World War for trench raids, night patrols, wire cutting, silent movement, and crossing no man's land. On the Western Front, Canadian raiding parties had crawled through mud, shell holes, and barbed wire to strike German trenches, and return before the enemy fully understood what had happened. They learned that no man's land was not truly empty. It was full of shell holes, shadows, wire gaps, dead ground, and tiny routes that only patient men could use. Veterans brought those lessons home. Families heard them. Sons grew up with them. And when a new generation volunteered in 1939, they carried both inheritances: the wilderness knowledge of Canada and the battlefield memory of the First World War. One of the clearest examples of that inheritance was Thomas George Prince. Tommy Prince was born in a canvas tent in Manitoba in 1915, the same year Canadian soldiers in Europe were learning the deadly art of night raiding. He was Ojibwe, from the Brokenhead Band, one of 11 children. His father was a hunter and trapper, and Tommy learned the bush before he learned war. He learned to track animals by signs so small that most people would never notice them: bent grass, scuffed bark, a faint mark in soft soil, a change in snow. He learned patience. He learned silence. He learned how to wait for hours without shifting his weight. He learned how to cross open areas by using the smallest details in the land. When he joined the army, those abilities became military power. In 1942, he was selected for the 1st Special Service Force, the joint Canadian-American commando unit that would become the Devil's Brigade. The training was extreme: hand-to-hand combat, demolitions, climbing, parachuting, skiing, amphibious assault, night raids, silent killing, stealth. For many volunteers, this was a new kind of life. For Tommy Prince, parts of it were simply the old life pointed at a new enemy. He was not learning how to become invisible. He was learning how to use a lifetime of invisibility in war. And at Anzio, he performed one of the most audacious acts of battlefield deception of the Second World War. In February 1944, Allied forces were trapped in the Anzio beachhead, under constant pressure from German artillery. The Allies needed to know exactly where the guns were. Prince volunteered to move forward and observe. He reached an abandoned farmhouse between the lines and ran a telephone wire back to Allied positions so he could report German targets. For days, he stayed there, watching through cracks and openings, calling in coordinates that helped destroy German guns and vehicles. Then a shell cut the wire. Prince had a choice. He could abandon the observation post. He could crawl back and survive. Or he could somehow repair the wire in ground watched by German soldiers. He chose a third option no manual could have predicted. He found civilian clothes inside the farmhouse, put them over his uniform, picked up a farm tool, and walked out in broad daylight pretending to be an Italian farmer. German soldiers saw him. They watched him, and they did not shoot, because Prince understood something deeper than camouflage. He understood perception. He did not hide from their eyes. He controlled what their eyes believed. To them, he was not a commando. He was a local farmer irritated by the war. He moved slowly through the field, working the soil, gradually reaching the broken wire. Then he bent down as if adjusting something near his foot, repaired the line, stood up, shook his fist toward the German position like an annoyed civilian, and walked back to the farmhouse. The Germans never understood that they had just watched an enemy scout repair a communication line under their noses. That is why men like Prince haunted them. He did not merely use cover. He used expectation. He used patience. He used the enemy's assumptions against them. And to German soldiers already frightened by night raids and silent killings, men like him seemed less like ordinary infantry and more like ghosts. But the Germans made a dangerous mistake. They believed this kind of skill belonged only to special troops, commandos, raiders, men from elite units. What they did not yet understand was that the Canadian Army carried versions of this ability far beyond the Devil's Brigade. Not every Canadian soldier was Tommy Prince. No army is made entirely of legends. But enough Canadian infantrymen, scouts, snipers, hunters, farmers, trappers, and Indigenous volunteers understood land in ways that made Canadian movement unusually difficult to predict. And on June 6, 1944, that reality landed in France, Juno Beach, Normandy. The Canadian 3rd Infantry Division was assigned one of the most heavily defended sectors of the Atlantic Wall. German planners had turned the coast into a killing zone: bunkers, mines, machine guns, artillery, fortified houses, seawalls, pre-registered fire zones. The beach was open, exposed, and deadly. The first wave took heavy losses. Men died in the water. Men died on the sand. Men died trying to cross the seawall and reach the exits. For those first terrible minutes there was no mystery. The Germans could see them, and men who could be seen could be killed. But once the Canadians fought their way off the beach and into the countryside beyond Juno, the character of the battle began to change. Behind the coast lay wheat fields, orchards, lanes, hedges, farm buildings, and small villages. The Germans had prepared defensive positions to cover the obvious approaches. They expected infantry to move from hedge to hedge, wall to wall, ditch to ditch, using cover that could be seen from a distance. But Canadian sections often moved in ways that disrupted those expectations. A German observer would see them enter a field. Then they would vanish, not behind smoke, not behind a wall, not into a trench. They would disappear into the field itself. Minutes later, fire would come from somewhere the Germans had not marked as occupied. A shallow drainage line, a wheat row, a slight depression where two fields met, a ditch too small to look useful. The Canadians were not protected from bullets by wheat. They were protected from observation by broken shape, timing, and ground. There is a huge difference. Wheat does not stop machine gun fire, but it can hide the moment a man changes direction. It can break the outline of a helmet. It can make a crawling soldier vanish long enough to move where the enemy does not expect him. A more predictable unit might advance in bounds. One group firing, another group sprinting to the next clear cover point. That method works, but it can also become readable. German machine gunners could learn the pattern and fire at the next likely position before the attackers arrived. Canadian movement often looked more irregular, more patient, more difficult to anticipate. They used small ground, micro-terrain, furrows, drainage cuts, low spots, shadow, edges. They did not always go where the defender expected, and that created fear. By 1944, Canadian battalions had scout and sniper platoons, usually made up of men selected because they could move, observe, and return without being detected. Many were exactly the kind of men Canada had produced in remote country. Hunters from British Columbia, trappers from Ontario, prairie farm boys, Indigenous volunteers from northern and western communities, men whose childhoods had trained them to notice small things. A scout might take an hour to cross a distance another soldier would run in seconds, but the scout would arrive alive. More importantly, he would arrive unseen. German defenders facing Canadian units in Normandy began to experience a specific anxiety. They could not always establish a pattern. They could not reliably predict where the next threat would appear. A field that looked empty would suddenly produce rifle fire. A flank that seemed secure would be compromised. A ditch dismissed as useless would become an approach route. The Germans were not facing invisible men. They were facing men who could use parts of the battlefield that German eyes had already ignored. And this is the key to everything. Every time a German officer wrote that Canadians disappeared in open ground, he was not describing magic. He was describing a failure of perception. He was admitting, without fully realizing it, that the Canadians were reading the battlefield at a level of detail his men could not match. The Germans saw a field. The Canadians saw a route. The Germans saw a ditch too shallow to matter. The Canadians saw enough. The Germans saw open ground. The Canadians saw a way through. And soon, in the flooded polders of the Scheldt, that difference would be tested in one of the most brutal battlefields of the war. A place so flat, so exposed, and so heavily watched that German officers believed no infantry could cross it without being destroyed. But once again, the Canadians would move through ground the enemy thought was impossible. And what happened there would prove that the real secret was never a weapon, never a trick, and never a miracle. It was something much older, the ability to read the earth better than the men trying to kill you. October 1944, the Scheldt estuary. If Normandy had been dangerous, the Scheldt was cruel in a different way. This was not a battlefield of forests, ridges, stone villages, or rolling hills. This was polder country, land reclaimed from the sea, drained by canals, protected by dikes, and soaked so deeply that every step felt like the earth was trying to hold a man down. To the Germans, it looked like a defender's dream. To the Canadians, it looked like a nightmare they would have to cross anyway. From the raised dikes, German machine gunners could look down across the fields, as if they were watching from the top row of a stadium. Roads were exposed. Canal banks were watched. Ditches were registered for mortar fire. Fields were flooded. Mud swallowed boots. The sky was wide open. There were no forests to disappear into, no hills to hide behind, no walls to protect an advance. A man standing upright could be seen from a distance. A man crawling could still be spotted if the light caught him at the wrong angle. German officers looked at that ground and believed one thing with complete confidence: nobody could move across it without being seen. And if they could be seen, they could be killed. But then the Canadians arrived, and the Germans began writing the same kind of reports they had written in Italy and Normandy. Men appearing where no one had seen them approach. Positions attacked from directions believed secure. Sentries insisting the fields had been empty, only to discover Canadian infantry already close enough to strike. It sounded impossible, but it was not impossible. It was Canada's old lesson, carried into Europe again. Open ground is only open to the man who does not know how to read it. The reason the Scheldt mattered was simple. Antwerp had been captured, but the port was useless while German forces still controlled the water approaches leading to it. The Allies desperately needed that port. Without it, supplies had to travel longer and longer routes from Normandy, slowing the advance toward Germany. So the 1st Canadian Army was ordered to clear the Scheldt. It was a brutal assignment. It was necessary, and it would become one of the hardest Canadian battles of the war. The Germans understood the value of the ground they held. They had fortified dikes, villages, canal crossings, and islands of dry land surrounded by mud and water. Every road could become a killing lane. Every crossing point could be turned into a trap. Tanks could not move freely through flooded fields. Vehicles were restricted to roads the Germans already had under observation. That meant infantry would have to do the impossible the old-fashioned way. On foot, in darkness, through water, mud, and open ground. This is where the story stops being about one legendary commando and becomes about an entire way of war. The scout platoons moved first. They entered ditches filled with freezing water, sometimes waist-deep, sometimes up to the chest. They moved slowly because speed would make noise. They moved in single file because the banks were too narrow for anything else. They carried weapons, ammunition, and equipment while trying not to splash, not to slip, not to raise their heads at the wrong moment. When German flares went up, they stopped. Not slowed, stopped. Bodies pressed into mud, faces near the water, hands gripping whatever grass, roots, or bank edge could hold them in place. For those seconds, they were not advancing soldiers. They were part of the ditch. Imagine being one of those men. You are cold to the bone. Your uniform is soaked. Your hands are numb. The water smells of mud, rot, and war. Somewhere above you, German sentries are watching the field. A flare rises, and suddenly the night becomes white. Every instinct tells you to move, to breathe harder, to get lower, to run. But you cannot. You freeze. You become nothing. You wait for the flare to die. And when darkness returns, you move again. 1 yard, then another, then another. This was not the kind of heroism that looks glorious from far away. This was quiet, miserable courage, the kind that wins ground inch by inch. To the German observer on the dike, the field still looked empty. Maybe he saw water shining in the flare light, maybe reeds moving, maybe the wind passing over grass, maybe a ditch that appeared too shallow, too exposed, too useless for an assault route. But what he did not see was the line of men beneath his field of vision, using the land at a level his training had not taught him to respect. And that was the Canadian advantage. Not invisibility in the magical sense. Invisibility through discipline, timing, stillness, and the ability to turn small terrain into survival. By dawn, German soldiers sometimes found Canadians far closer than they believed possible. In some cases, inside or near defensive positions that had been watched all night. That kind of thing changes a soldier's mind. A man can trust a bunker. He can trust wire. He can trust machine guns. He can trust flares. But when enemy soldiers arrive through ground he believed impossible, he begins to distrust everything. He looks at an empty field and wonders if it is really empty. He hears water moving and wonders if it is just water. He sees a ditch and wonders if men are inside it. Fear changes shape. It stops being fear of bullets and becomes fear of the unseen. German prisoners from the Scheldt often gave answers that sounded almost helpless. They had seen nothing. Their sentries had reported nothing. Their fields of fire looked clear. Their wire seemed intact. Their observation posts had not raised alarms. And yet the Canadians were there. Some described it as if the attackers had come up through the ground itself. That phrase matters, because to the Germans, it felt true. If you cannot see the route, the arrival feels supernatural. If you cannot understand the method, the result feels impossible. But the Canadians had not come from underground. They had come through ditches, waterlines, shadows, depressions, reed beds, muddy cuts, and the dead spaces between German assumptions. And this is the deeper answer to the title. Germans could not explain how Canadians disappeared in open ground because they were looking at the ground from the wrong height, the wrong history, and the wrong culture. A German officer standing on a dike saw flat land. A Canadian scout lying in the mud saw a route. A German machine gunner saw an empty field. A Canadian infantryman saw the shallow line where water had drained. A German observer dismissed a 4-inch depression as nothing. A Canadian from the prairie, the bush, the north, or a farm understood that 4 inches could hide enough of a man to keep him alive. In war, enough is everything. That is the part no manual could easily teach. The Germans wanted a tactic they could name. They wanted to know what method the Canadians were using so they could counter it. More flares, more patrols, better wire, more machine guns. But the problem was not only defensive equipment, it was perception. The Canadians were not using one single trick. They were using thousands of small judgments made by men who had been shaped by land long before the army shaped them. A trapper's patience, a farmer's understanding of slope and field, a hunter's stillness, an indigenous scout's inherited knowledge of movement, track, shadow, wind, water, and silence, a First World War tradition of trench raiding and night movement, a training system that turned instinct into battlefield skill. Together, those things created soldiers who did not always move where the enemy expected them to move. If you are still watching, this is the moment where the story becomes bigger than tactics. So hit the like button if this kind of history deserves to be remembered, and subscribe if you want more forgotten stories told with the details that make them come alive. Because what made these Canadian soldiers so dangerous was not only what they did in battle, it was what their lives had taught them before battle ever began. The German army of 1944 was not ignorant. It was not careless. Its officers were serious professionals. They studied terrain, firepower, movement, defense, and the psychology of battle. They had fought for years across Europe, North Africa, and the Eastern Front. They knew how to punish predictable infantry. They knew how to build defensive lines. They knew how to turn open ground into a graveyard. But that expertise also created a blind spot. Their understanding of concealment was built from a European world. Cover meant something visible and obvious: a wall, a hedge, a trench, a building, a forest edge, a ditch deep enough to hide a standing or kneeling man. If those things were absent, the ground was called open. And open ground, under observation, was supposed to belong to the defender. Against many soldiers, that logic worked. Against Canadians, it was incomplete. Because many Canadian soldiers did not define cover the way a standing observer defined it. They defined cover from the ground up. Could a man crawl there? Could he break his outline? Could he hide his helmet? Could he move when the wind moved the grass? Could he use the shadow under the bank? Could he reach the next ditch before the flare rose? Could he freeze long enough for the observer's eyes to slide past him? That kind of thinking turns a battlefield into something different. It turns empty land into a set of possibilities. This is why the same German language appears across different battles. They disappear. They move without sound. They appear from nowhere. We do not see them until they are inside the line. Those words were not written because the Germans were cowards. They were written because trained soldiers were encountering an enemy whose movement did not fit their expectations. And war is often decided by expectations. If you expect a man to run to the hedge, you aim at the hedge. If he crawls through a drainage rut instead, your weapon is watching the wrong place. If you expect cover to be tall, you ignore the shallow dip. If he uses the shallow dip, he is already closer than you think. That is what made Canadian movement so unsettling. It was not always fast. It was not always dramatic. In fact, much of it was slow, dirty, cold, and exhausting. But it was difficult to predict. It used patience as a weapon, and patience is terrifying to a defender because it means the attacker is willing to wait longer than your attention can hold. Think about the psychology of that. A sentry watching an open field at night can stay alert for a while, but after 10 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour, His mind begins to simplify what he sees. Grass becomes grass. Water becomes water. Mud becomes mud. The eye stops searching for what it does not expect. A Canadian scout using stillness understands this. A hunter understands this. A trapper understands this. The moment the observer stops truly seeing, the ground begins to open. This was not just theory. It shaped real battles. In the Scheldt, Canadian troops paid a terrible price. Thousands became casualties in weeks of fighting. The terrain was brutal. The Germans were determined. The weather was miserable. Progress was slow and costly. There was nothing easy about it. But the Canadians advanced through ground that heavily favored the defender. They crossed ditches, flooded fields, canals, mudflats, causeways, and dikes. They did not do it because they were immune to fear. They did it because their army had learned that terrain could be negotiated in ways the enemy did not expect. They did it because someone had to open Antwerp. They did it because the war depended on logistics as much as battlefield glory. And they did it because, again and again, Canadian infantry found routes where German defenders saw none. But the story of these men cannot end only on the battlefield, because many of the skills that helped Canada in war came from people and communities that Canada itself did not always honor in peace. That truth is uncomfortable, but it belongs in the story. Indigenous soldiers served with courage in both world wars. Many brought extraordinary abilities as scouts, snipers, trackers, and infantrymen. Their service was praised when it was useful. Their skill was admired when it helped win battles. But after the war, many returned to discrimination, restrictions, and a government system that did not treat them as equal citizens. Tommy Prince is the most powerful example. During the war, he became one of the most decorated Indigenous soldiers in Canadian history. He operated behind enemy lines. He directed fire onto German positions. He repaired a telephone line in daylight while disguised as a civilian under the eyes of the enemy. He earned recognition from Canada and the United States. German soldiers feared men like him because they seemed impossible to detect. But when he returned home, he did not return to a country that fully recognized his dignity. He returned to a Canada where Indigenous people still faced legal and social barriers that should never have existed. The same man who had walked under German observation and survived could not simply walk into equality at home. That is one of the painful contradictions of this history. In war, his country needed his courage. In peace, it failed too often to honor the man behind that courage. Prince served again in Korea, proving that his bravery was not confined to one battlefield. But civilian life was hard. Like many veterans, he carried wounds that were not always visible. Like many Indigenous veterans, he faced obstacles that were deeper than ordinary hardship. He advocated. He struggled. He was remembered by comrades, honored by some, ignored by others, and never given in life the full measure of recognition he deserved. When Tommy Prince died in 1977, he left behind a story that is both heroic and heartbreaking. Heroic because of what he did under fire. Heartbreaking because of what he faced after the shooting stopped. And maybe that is why his story matters so much. He was not just a soldier who could disappear in open ground. He was a man his enemies could not see in war, and a man his own country too often failed to see clearly in peace. Many others shared quieter versions of that fate. Canadian scouts, snipers, riflemen, engineers, and infantrymen came home from Europe and rarely spoke about what they had done. Some returned to farms, some to cities, some to northern communities, some to families that could never fully understand what they had seen. They carried memories of fields, ditches, raids, shellfire, friends lost, and nights when silence meant survival. Many names never became famous. Many stories stayed inside regimental histories, family memories, or fading photographs. But their effect on the battlefield was real. They were the men who made German sentries fear empty ground, and that may be the most haunting image in this whole story. A German soldier staring at a field that looks empty, knowing that Canadians might already be inside it. That fear did not come from propaganda. It came from experience. It came from finding dead sentries where no attacker should have reached them. It came from hearing nothing all night and discovering cut wires at dawn. It came from seeing Canadian troops vanish into wheat, mud, reeds, darkness, and shallow ditches. It came from the repeated failure of observation. And once that fear entered the mind, every field became suspect. Every ditch became a possible approach. Every patch of darkness became dangerous. Modern war is often remembered through machines, tanks, aircraft, artillery, ships, industry, technology, and all of those things mattered enormously. But this story reminds us that war is still fought by human beings with human senses. A man sees or fails to see. A man hears or fails to hear. A man understands ground or misunderstands it. A man decides whether a ditch matters. A man decides whether a field is empty. And sometimes the difference between life and death is not a bigger weapon. It is a better reading of the earth. The Germans could counter many things. They could counter a frontal assault with machine guns. They could counter armor with anti-tank weapons. They could counter artillery by digging deeper. They could counter predictable infantry movement with prepared fire. But they struggled to counter an enemy who used cover they did not recognize as cover. You cannot block a route you do not see. You cannot aim at a movement that never looks like movement. You cannot write a proper doctrine against a skill that exists below the threshold of your perception. That is why their confusion kept repeating. Italy, Normandy, the Scheldt, the Rhineland. Different battlefields, same question. How did they get there? How did they cross that? Where did they go? The answer was never a secret device. It was never a miracle. It was the accumulated knowledge of a vast country carried inside ordinary men. Canada's forests, Canada's prairies, Canada's frozen lakes, Canada's trap lines, Canada's farms, Canada's reserves, Canada's northern silence, Canada's distance. All of it shaped men who learned to pay attention to details that others ignored. Not every Canadian soldier was a wilderness expert. That would not be true. Canada also sent men from cities, factories, offices, schools, and neighborhoods far from the bush or prairie. But enough men carried those skills, and enough training reinforced them, that the Canadian Army developed a reputation for movement, scouting, raiding, and fieldcraft that German soldiers remembered. The skill spread through units. Scouts guided riflemen. Veterans taught replacements. Training gave language to instinct. Experience sharpened everything. And by 1944, when Canadian infantry moved through European terrain, they brought with them more than weapons. They brought a different relationship with land. That relationship is the real answer. The Germans saw the battlefield as a surface to dominate with observation and fire. The Canadians often saw it as something to enter, read, and use. The Germans looked for cover. The Canadians looked for route. The Germans watched for men. The Canadians became shapes that did not look like men until it was too late. That is why a field could swallow them. That is why a ditch could carry them. That is why a German officer could stare at open ground and still lose the men moving across it. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Canada had paid a heavy price. More than 42,000 Canadians were killed in the Second World War. Many more came home wounded, physically and mentally. They had fought through Sicily, Italy, Normandy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and into Germany. They had crossed beaches, rivers, canals, flooded fields, and fortified lines. They had advanced through places where the enemy believed they could not advance. And then, like all soldiers, those who survived had to return to a world that could never fully understand what they had done. Today, the dikes of the Scheldt still rise above the flat land. The fields still stretch beneath wide skies. The drainage ditches still cut through the polders. In Normandy, wheat still grows in fields where men once crawled under fire. In Italy, canals still divide the ground where sentries once waited in the dark. If you stand there now, you might see what the Germans saw. Open land, empty space, nothing moving, no obvious cover, no obvious route. But that is exactly the point. Because a Canadian scout from 1944 would not have seen emptiness. He would have seen the low place where water gathers, the shadow along the bank, the slight dip between two fields, the taller grass near the ditch, the line of mud that would hide a crawl, the route you would miss because you did not know it was a route. And that is why the German reports were true. They really could not explain it. Not because Canadians broke the laws of war, but because they broke the assumptions of the men watching them. They did not become invisible by vanishing. They became invisible by understanding what others overlooked. They used the ground the way another soldier might use a weapon. They turned patience into movement. They turned stillness into camouflage. They turned inches into survival. So when you hear that German soldiers said Canadians disappeared in open ground, do not imagine magic. Imagine a man lying in mud while a flare burns overhead. Imagine him not breathing for 3 seconds longer than fear wants him to. Imagine him moving only when the grass moves. Imagine him seeing a path in a field everyone else calls empty. Imagine generations of hunters, farmers, trappers, scouts and soldiers behind that one movement. That is what the Germans were facing. Not ghosts. Men who had learned to make the earth hide them. And maybe that is why this story still matters. Because it proves that history is not only shaped by generals, machines and maps. Sometimes it is shaped by the quiet knowledge carried inside ordinary people. A farmer who understands a field. A hunter who understands stillness. A scout who understands mud. A soldier who sees a way through when everyone else sees death. The Germans thought they were watching open ground, but the Canadians were reading it. And by the time the enemy understood the difference, it was already too late. If this story stayed with you, leave a like so more people can hear it. Subscribe for more forgotten military history told the way it deserves to be told. And write in the comments where you are watching from. If someone in your family served in the Second World War, Canadian, American, British, Dutch, Australian, Indigenous, or from any allied nation, leave their name below, because every name matters, every story matters. And sometimes, the men history almost forgets are the same men who once moved through impossible ground so quietly that the enemy never saw them coming.